The sun hung high over the dry valley when Daniel Carter finally stopped working the fence. The land around his ranch stretched wide and dusty beneath the summer heat. For 3 months, the rain had barely touched the ground. The river that once ran near the ranch had shrunk into a thin line of muddy water. Daniel wiped the sweat from his forehead and leaned against the wooden post. He had lived on this ranch for almost 15 years, and he had seen dry seasons before. But this one felt different. The ground cracked beneath his boots, and even the cattle had grown quiet under the relentless sun. He picked up his hammer and finished fixing the final nail in the fence. When the work was done, he turned toward the house to get a drink from the well. That was when he noticed something moving on the distant road. At first, it looked like a small shadow in the heat waves rising from the dirt. But slowly, the figure became clearer. It was a boy. The child walked slowly along the road, carrying a small metal bucket in both hands. His steps looked heavy, like every mile had taken the last bit of strength from him. Daniel frowned. Out here, children rarely traveled alone. He stepped closer to the gate and waited. The boy continued walking until he reached the wooden fence outside the ranch. By the time he stopped, his clothes were dusty and his face red from the heat. He looked no older than 9. The bucket he carried was empty. The boy lifted his eyes toward Daniel. "Sir," his voice came out dry and weak. "May I have some water?" Daniel stared at him for a moment before opening the gate. "Of course." He led the boy toward the well near the house. The child watched quietly as Daniel lowered the bucket into the cool darkness of the well and pulled it back up, filled with fresh water. When Daniel handed it to him, the boy didn't drink immediately. He carefully filled his small bucket first. Then he took only 2 small sips. Daniel noticed that right away. "You can drink more," he said gently. The boy shook his head. "This water isn't for me." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Then who is it for?" The boy hesitated before answering. "My mama." Daniel leaned against the well. "How far did you walk?" 2 miles, the boy said quietly. "Our well dried up last week." Daniel felt a weight settle in his chest. He looked at the boy again. Thin arms, tired eyes, dusty boots that had clearly walked far more than a child should have to. "What's your name?" Daniel asked. "Samuel." "Where do you live, Samuel?" The boy pointed toward the hills beyond the dry fields. "Small cabin past the ridge." Daniel knew the place. A poor stretch of land where only a few families had ever tried to live. "Your father home?" The boy's eyes dropped to the ground. "He died last winter." Daniel looked away toward the empty road for a moment. He had heard stories like this before, but something about the way the boy protected that bucket of water made the situation feel heavier than usual. Samuel lifted the bucket carefully again. "Thank you, sir." He turned as if preparing to start the long walk back. Daniel stopped him. "Hold on." The boy paused. Daniel walked inside the house and returned with a larger jug. He filled it with cool well water and handed it to the boy. "Take this too." Samuel's eyes widened. "It's too much." "Water shouldn't be something a child has to measure," Daniel replied quietly. The boy hesitated but finally accepted the jug. "Thank you." He started walking toward the road again, but after a few steps he turned back. "Sir, may I ask you something else?" Daniel nodded. "Go ahead." Samuel looked down at the ground as if gathering courage. If my mama gets worse, could I come back for more water tomorrow?" Daniel felt his throat tighten slightly. "Of course you can." Samuel nodded gratefully and began the long walk back toward the hills. Daniel watched him disappear into the dusty distance. The image of the small boy carrying water beneath the burning sun stayed in his mind the entire afternoon. When evening came, Daniel sat on his porch, staring toward the ridge. He kept thinking about the boy's words. "If my mama gets worse." Night slowly settled over the ranch. The sky turned orange and then deep blue as the stars appeared one by one. Daniel finally stood and walked to the barn. He saddled his horse and filled 2 large water containers. He also packed a small bag with bread, beans, and medicine he kept for emergencies. The horse snorted softly as he tightened the saddle straps. Daniel climbed up and turned the horse toward the distant ridge. He rode across the dry fields beneath the rising moon. The path grew rougher as he approached the hills. After nearly 40 minutes, he spotted the small cabin Samuel had mentioned. A weak light flickered inside through the dusty window. Daniel dismounted quietly and approached the door. He knocked softly. The door opened slowly. Samuel stood there, surprised to see him. "Sir?" Daniel lifted the water containers. "I thought you might need help carrying tomorrow's water." The boy's eyes filled with relief. He stepped aside to let Daniel enter. The inside of the cabin was small and poorly lit. On a narrow bed near the wall lay a thin woman covered in blankets. Her breathing sounded weak. Samuel walked to her side. "Mama," the cowboy from the ranch came. The woman opened her tired eyes and looked at Daniel with quiet embarrassment. "You didn't need to come all this way," she said softly. Daniel placed the water containers near the table. "Your son walked 2 miles for water today." He glanced at Samuel before continuing. "I figured the least I could do was walk the rest." The woman closed her eyes for a moment like she was fighting tears. Daniel looked around the small cabin. The shelves were nearly empty. There was barely any food left. Samuel stood silently beside him, still holding the little bucket he had carried earlier. Daniel suddenly realized something. The boy had not asked for water because he was thirsty. He had asked because his mother might not survive without it. And that simple request had broken something open inside the cowboy that he didn't know still existed. Daniel stood quietly in the small cabin for a moment, looking around at the thin walls, the nearly empty shelves, and the tired woman lying on the bed. The room smelled faintly of dust and sickness. Samuel placed the small bucket of water carefully beside the table, like it was the most valuable thing in the world. The woman tried to sit up, but Daniel stepped forward quickly. "Don't push yourself," he said gently. She gave a weak smile. "My name is Maria," Daniel nodded. "Daniel Carter." Samuel stood beside the bed watching both of them. "Mama was sick before the well dried," he explained softly, "but the heat made it worse." Daniel looked at the water containers he had brought. He poured a glass and handed it to Maria. She drank slowly, like each sip gave her a little strength back. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel walked to the small window and looked outside. The moonlight showed the dry land stretching endlessly around the cabin. He turned back toward Samuel. "How long has the well been empty?" "A week," the boy answered. "I tried digging deeper, but I couldn't reach water." Daniel rubbed his chin thoughtfully. He knew the land well enough to understand the problem. The underground stream that once fed several wells in the valley had likely shifted after months of drought. It happened sometimes in dry years. He stepped outside and walked around the cabin with a lantern. Samuel followed closely behind. "What are you looking for?" the boy asked. "A better place to dig," Daniel replied. The ground behind the cabin sloped slightly downward toward a patch of darker soil. Daniel crouched and pushed the dirt aside with his boot. The soil underneath felt cooler. He nodded slowly. "Water runs under here." Samuel's eyes widened. "Really?" Daniel stood up. "Maybe not deep." The boy looked hopeful for the first time since Daniel had met him. But Daniel knew digging a new well would take days, work too heavy for a sick woman and a 9-year-old boy. He turned toward the horse and untied the shovel hanging beside the saddle. "We start tonight," he said. Samuel blinked. "Tonight?" Daniel pushed the shovel into the dirt. "Water can't wait until morning." For the next hour, the quiet hills echoed with the steady sound of digging. Samuel helped by carrying away loose dirt, while Daniel dug deeper into the earth. The soil grew cooler as the hole widened. Maria watched from the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. Her tired eyes followed the lantern light moving across the yard. After nearly 2 hours, Daniel finally struck a layer of damp clay. He knelt down and pressed his hand against it. A faint smile appeared. "We're close," he said. Samuel leaned over the edge of the hole. The boy's face was covered in dirt, but his eyes shined with excitement. Then suddenly a thin trickle of water seeped through the clay. The small stream slowly filled the bottom of the hole. Samuel gasped. Water! Daniel leaned back on the shovel, breathing heavily. The trickle wasn't much, but it was enough to refill slowly if they lined the well properly. He climbed out of the hole and wiped the sweat from his forehead. Tomorrow we reinforce it with stones, he said, but this will hold for now. Samuel grabbed the small bucket and lowered it carefully. When he pulled it back up, clear water shimmered inside under the lantern light. The boy stared at it like he was looking at treasure. Maria stepped closer to the edge of the new well. Her voice trembled. You did this? For us? Daniel shrugged lightly. Your son already walked the hard miles. Samuel ran forward and hugged him without warning. Daniel froze for a moment before gently patting the boy's shoulder. The mountains around them had grown quiet again. The night air felt cooler now, carrying the soft sound of water slowly filling the small well. The next morning, Daniel returned with tools, wooden boards, and stones from his ranch. He spent the entire day strengthening the well walls, while Samuel helped carry rocks. By sunset, the small well stood firm and steady behind the cabin. Maria stepped outside again, looking stronger than the day before. She filled a glass with the new water and handed it to Samuel. The boy drank freely this time without fear of wasting it. He smiled wider than Daniel had ever seen. The sun slowly disappeared behind the hills, painting the sky orange and gold. Daniel packed his tools and prepared to leave. Samuel walked beside him to the horse. Will you come back? The boy asked. Daniel looked toward the small cabin and the new well shining softly in the evening light. Then he looked back at Samuel. Someone has to make sure that well keeps working, the boy grinned. Maria stood in the doorway, watching quietly. The dry valley had not changed. The heat would still come tomorrow. But something important had changed for the small family living in that cabin. Because one boy had walked 2 miles for water, and one cowboy had decided that no child should ever have to walk that far again.